So we've come to a time period now, as we're getting into the 15th century, where missions begins to take a change simply because of two things that are happening. One, and the one we'll address in this particular session, has to do with the ambitions of a variety of European powers to expand their empires, expand their control. And as they desire this expansion, that leads them into contact with peoples that they decide also, in addition to a variety of other nationalistic and imperialistic desires, they also want to see converted. Sometimes not for the best reasons, sometimes for good reasons. So, when it comes to thinking about the people involved with evangelistic enterprise, the missionary enterprise, in this time period, the time period of discovery and expansion and conquest, there were people that approached the goal of sharing the gospel with good motives, wanting to see people converted, and there were other people, sometimes those in power in particular, who sought power through missionary efforts, that by converting other peoples, other nation groups, other indigenous peoples, it was thought that it would make the process of conquest easier. So missionary enterprise becomes secondary to a primary goal of expanding the empire. And so we have this kind of dualistic approach that people are engaging in. Around the same time, slightly before, but pretty close to the same time, enough for us to kind of parallel them, missionary efforts are being done in the name of a variety of movements that are deemed heretical. And that focus will be the second session of videos. For some of that, we'll again turn to Professor Reeves, just to give you, again, kind of another voice on this, some additional information. I think that he does a great job of presenting some things, but his focus, of course, is not specifically on missionary efforts, so we'll kind of let him set the stage for some things and then talk about missionary work. But in a sense, what's taking place in these heretical movements is missionary endeavors in attempting to get certain ideas out. And so it looks slightly different than perhaps what we think of as missionary work, especially if we think about it in terms of going to a different culture than one's own and seeking a total conversion from a completely non-Christian worldview to a Christian one. So in this first session, again, where the focus is going to be more on conquest and missions, how those two were intertwined, and some of the efforts that various peoples and groups took to bring about the evangelism of particularly peoples of the Americas, but we'll also talk about some situations in the East as well, the Far East. In some ways, it's appropriate to make sure we understand that mission work and imperialism were intertwined. And all of the things that these explorers and these various captains and people that we think of when we think of the discovery of the Americas, and of course discovery there is used in the terms of European discovery. Of course, there are a lot of peoples there already, so it's not like it's a total discovery. But this is all tied together with a Christian worldview, that the people that are coming and the people that are exploring and the people that are seeking to expand empires are doing so on the basis of certain views of Christianity. Now, in some ways, it would be appropriate to judge and critique some of these individuals and cite them for failing to live up to Christian principles, for failing to exhibit Christianity to the peoples that they encountered, and quite rightly. On the other hand, it's appropriate to see that even those who are engaging in endeavors that we would find abhorrent, that we would find disturbing, that we would reject, are doing so in the context of a Christian worldview. One that is shaped and skewed by European interests, absolutely, but at base it is a view that has some very common pieces to it, like what we would have even today. Although the how you work that out, of course, would be something that would be certainly different, and that in many respects is similar to is evident in Columbus. Columbus was, from all accounts, deeply religious. Of course, from a Catholic standpoint here, we're still in a period where the majority of Europe that is Christian is Catholic. And in many respects as well, he is shaped by the remnants of that Crusader mentality from the later Middle Ages. That the instability of the Middle East in the late 15th century is wrapped up with Columbus's desire to see kind of this last crusade, the expansion of Christianity, and additionally, the end of Islamic power. On the other hand, of course, he's also motivated by wealth, and the opportunities that his efforts will bring him greater riches are certainly not, that is certainly not a something that we should ignore here. But in some respects, his efforts are, yes, to develop a different route to the Far East, but also, there's missionary ideas connected with that. And, part of it is the wealth, part of it is the riches, part of it is the acclaim, and then part of it is, wanting to see people receive the gospel. But in many respects, the view that Columbus has is very apocalyptic. And this is reflected in a journal that Columbus kept called the Book of Prophecies. And in his Book of Prophecies, Columbus recorded a variety of views of so-called prophets, end times views, that were around. In Survey Church History, we talked about Joachim Fiore and his views of the end times. Now, particularly, he fought the year 1200. So Columbus is living, 2.5 centuries after. It's obvious that Joachim Fiore is wrong about the date, but there's still this notion that the end times were upon the world. And so a lot of Europeans, Columbus included, saw this period as preparing to usher in the millennial age. And so his voyage is, in his mind, part of all of these prophecies that he is interested in. And particularly, one of those prophecies was the view that a Spanish emperor would end up ruling from Jerusalem. Now, Columbus, of course, is Italian, but he serves the Spanish crown. There's a lot of things related to the Reconquista at this time, the culmination of that. There are a lot of things related to the consolidation of power in Spain. There's the ties between Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. So there's all sorts of things that we need to kind of fully comprehend here in what Columbus entangled in. It's not as simple as perhaps we were led to believe in our school days about what Columbus's journey meant. And so Columbus, like a lot of other explorers, sees the world through a religious prism, sees the world through religious ideology and the Christian worldview, and sees his efforts in that context. And so one of the first places that he names is San Salvador, which is Spanish for our Savior. So this is a profoundly religious mission that Columbus is involved in his mind, that is representative of a lot of other explorers at the time. On the flip side of that, of course, is the way in which a lot of explorers, and Columbus included, while they have these lofty goals, often in practice, is not lived up to. He did not see the indigenous peoples of the Americas or the Caribbean as his equals. He certainly had the desire to Christianize them, but on the other side, he also wondered how they could be exploited for economic gain. And so he tried to export Native Americans to Europe as slaves, penned them up in the ships that made these journeys, with many of them dying during travel. Native Americans were used as slave labor to load the ships, and there were often quotas about different things, including gold. Like, there's a certain expectation of how much gold you're going to load in a ship per day, and if they did not fulfill it, they could have their hands cut off. So, Columbus is this very complex individual who has these religious goals, these lofty goals, these desires to see evangelism take place. On the other hand, he also has this side that is completely affected, or not completely, but is affected by the desire for wealth. Now, we shouldn't go too far with this, because we have to be careful of how far we pay attention to the atrocities. Now, there were atrocities, and it's very disturbing what was done, often by people claiming a Christian background. However, we don't want to go too far, because some of the stories that are told about this time are influenced by Protestants as Protestantism develops in the 16th century, who are trying to essentially connect Catholicism with these atrocities against Native Americans. And so we want to make sure that we don't overstate how much Catholicism is tied up with this, nor do we want to kind of get this picture that only Catholic explorers did these kind of things, and Protestant explorers, as Protestantism developed, don't do that. Hey, it was a violent conquest. We need to accept that. We need to come to grips with that. And sometimes, as Christians, we want to sugarcoat the actions of other Christians. Native Americans died from starvation. They died from forced labor. They died from European diseases like smallpox. As we get into the 16th and 17th century, they died from a slaughter. So there's all sorts of things that did happen, but it wasn't necessarily that the Catholics or the Spanish should be looked upon as somehow worse than other people. They had a different situation, so that maybe we should say, yes, there were more atrocities committed by the Spanish than others, but I think that had to do with just the opportunities that were there for Spain, and how Spain conquered some of these places. but that in many respects, given the opportunity, the French and English would have done very similar things had they been in similar situations, just based on what we see of the English and the French, in some of these things. The kind of the things they do, but on a smaller scale, because they start a little bit later, and they don't have the military might that the Spanish do, and some other things there as well. With the Spanish conquistadors, with the Spanish explorers, with the Spanish armies, came missionaries. And with those missionaries, or with respect to those missionaries, there were a couple of different groups that came. We're going to just focus on the Franciscans when it comes to Spain. There were Dominicans that came as well. There were Jesuits that came as well. But I want to focus on the Franciscans and think about some of the things that they were involved in when it comes to missionary work. The conquistadors and the Franciscans worked side by side in this effort. The religious mission of the Franciscans and the goals of conquest of the conquistadors, they happened at the same time, side by side. And so there's a conquest here in a sense. There's conquest certainly physically, but the Franciscans and others looked upon the spiritual efforts as conquest as well. Now, again, that's probably not a way that we would prefer missionaries to act. That in a sense, okay, conquest, if you're thinking about it in terms of working against the devil, okay, I see that, but that there's a lot here of just the conquest of native peoples. Now, certainly the Franciscans saw themselves as working against the devil. They looked upon native ways of life as being demonic, and that there was extensive demonic activity in the mind of Franciscans and others that were evangelizing Native Americans. They saw the devil at work on a lot of things. But thinking more now on the missionary efforts, a lot of the focus of the Franciscans was on the establishment of these mission towns, and so they populated all sorts of places. Ponce de Leon comes to North America, 1513. Starts in the Florida Peninsula. Priests were brought soon after that to establish missions, these mission towns. The Native Americans drove that group off, but another group comes in the middle of the 15th century, or excuse me, middle of the 16th century, the 1500s, and begins to establish other missions. And those efforts are a little bit more successful. The oldest city related to that is St. Augustine in Florida, founded in 1556. And it becomes the base for Catholic missions in Florida. By 1620, there are 44 established missions in Florida, and then the missions start extending in other places. Mexico, what we call Mexico, what was New Spain at the time. Southwest, what's now the Southwest United States. There were a variety of rebellions that occurred against some of these missions in the 1600s, and so they kind of died off, and then developed again in the late 1600s as some of these lands were recaptured from particularly the Pueblo. and then moved up the California coast. The missions were found in the Caribbean, South America, etc. When it came to missions, there's a couple of things to think about with the Franciscans. Now, if you remember some of the things that we talked about with Francis of Assisi and the formation of the Franciscans, there's a couple of things here that are important. One is the notions of poverty that are very important to the Franciscans, and with that is the notion of, kind of this rejection of society's trappings. That in choosing poverty, you are rejecting society. And so, when you think about what spirituality is from a Franciscan mindset, especially the Spanish Franciscans, the way that Christianity remains pure is through asceticism and disciplining the body. All right? It's the spiritual effort over the physical. And that's very important for the Franciscans. This, punishing the body almost. The second thing is the emphasis on youthfulness in the Franciscan mindset, and how there's an emphasis on converting of youth and rejecting your physical father for your spiritual father, whether that's the head of your order, whether that's the Pope, whether that's God. But there's this notion of you renouncing your physical father for your spiritual father. And so these ideas played into the missionary efforts of the Franciscans. There were a couple of other things to think about, though, with the missionary strategies. First was the practice of encomienda. Encomienda was a legal system for the colonization of North America. It was something developed by the Crown with the purpose of getting Spanish colonists to the Americas. We're in an empire-building race with the Spanish here. And if you can populate a region with Spanish, you can rightfully claim those places as Spanish and hold on to them more than just making a claim, but not having the people there. And so encomienda is a way to encourage people to get to the Americas. The other purpose behind it was to convert the Native Americans. So the idea was you give Spanish settlers large pieces of land. If you were willing to take that land, you also got the labor of all the Native Americans who lived on that land. However, you had to promise that you were going to instruct these Native Americans in the Catholic faith. So you have this system of slave labor with a missionary rationale attached to it. So that what essentially you're doing here is this is missionary work in their mindset, but it's also, of course, exploitation. It is also about imperialism. It is also about nation and wealth building. So there's a lot of things attached here with that. And what really happened, of course, you probably can figure out. The efforts of encomienda led to relatively minimal religious instruction. Instead, it was more about forced conversion. It was about slavery. In some ways, there might have been good intentions behind encomienda, but largely it is a failure from the missionary standpoint. By 1542, encomienda officially ended, legally ended, but the system was really so embedded in the efforts of Spanish settlement, that it was impossible for the elimination of it, and really affected all of the interactions between Spanish and Native Americans. Now, on the other hand, it's appropriate to recognize that there were missionaries who spoke out against encomienda. Some supported it, certainly, but others were very vocal in condemning the practice. Another effort was the use of missions, which we already kind of mentioned. These developments of these towns that were meant to be a reconstruction of Spanish life in the Americas. With the missions, the idea was to take the Native Americans from these areas and bring them to a specific place, these mission towns, and make them Spanish, not only in religion, but in culture and in language, etc. And so you have the creation of these towns. Well, think of the Alamo. Perhaps that's one of the most famous images of one of these missions. You have this very European-style town with town squares and villages, etc. It looks like Spain. Spanish is spoken there. There's Spanish culture there. And, I mean, this is what happens. The Native Americans are kind of forced into European culture in areas that they had originally lived in. You know, being forced to adopt dress and the food and the speech of Spain. With the missions, there were a couple of things that took place. One is the inversion of society. That essentially what the missions did was turn the society of Native Americans upside down. A good example of this is the experience of the Pueblo in what's now the Southwest United States. In the Pueblo, like with a lot of other Native American cultures, you think of your world as this circle, and you think of the world in terms of holiness, might be the best term, but the power and a lot of the positive things, the positive qualities you think of life, are in the center of that circle. And then there, of course, is the periphery. And so the further you go out, the further away you get from that center. And then, of course, outside the circle are the forces of chaos that seek to destroy society. And so how you set up your village, how the tribe was set up, was set around this notion of center and periphery, so that the things that are most important to your society, you put in the center. The things that are holiest, things that are the most valued, which would be things like, ancient things, the holy people, the religious actors, the shamans, they're in the center of the town. On the periphery of the town are the warriors who are going to protect. Right? The younger people are further away from the center. The people that are involved with issues of force and violence in protection and in conquest, they're further from the periphery, because the idea is you're trying to protect from the outside forces. And so those who participate in this violence, the hunters, the warriors, etc., on the outside. Additionally, there was a lot of notion of reciprocity, of balance. And this relationship between old and young was one of reciprocity, one of gift-giving, and there was a lot of respect that was due to those that were older. Well, when the missions were invented, and when the Spanish came in and started creating these missions, they turned this upside down, because they would build their missions right in the center of the village. right? The place that was considered to be the holiness, now these forces of chaos from outside, now they are establishing their presence in the very holiest place of the way you conceive the world. The other way in which this was an inversion had to do with how the Franciscans approached the different members of society, particularly contrasting older and younger. In many respects, the Franciscans focused on elevating the youth and engaging the youth and humiliating the elderly. And so there were efforts to give gifts to the young people of society, which then put you in a reciprocal relationship with expectations that a Native American would return this gift to you, or were held in obligation, so to speak, because of this gift giving. One of the ways that the message of Christianity was communicated was through a variety of plays. You remember from Survey of Church History, we had talked about the variety of different types of plays, miracle plays, mystery plays, that were developed in the later Middle Ages as an effort to communicate the faith. Well, these were used in attempting to communicate the faith to Native American cultures, and so the younger people would be given roles that were positive, right? Angels or virtues, right? And then the older people would be given roles that were the demonic, that were the vices of society, and so you're kind of elevating the young at expense of the old, so inverting the society, which tended to focus on the elderly. Another thing that was an important aspect of this missionary strategy was an emphasis on visual objects and visual efforts to communicate Christianity. The idea being that it was through these types of efforts that it would be easier to grasp Catholicism if people were able to comprehend the visual, because there's a language barrier. And the Franciscans were not interested in learning the language of the Native Americans, and those that did not learn it very well. So you're communicating Christianity through objects, through ceremonies, as opposed to theological instruction. The saints, of course, would have been important in this, because you can have a picture of a saint, or Mary, or a crucifix. And so you're expressing your faith in these symbols, right? The cross, Virgin Mary, even baptism, which means that you're not able to communicate what was for the time a very complex theological structure. In many respects, you think about some of the things that are key ideas within Christianity. How do you express the Trinity clearly in a piece of art in such a way that you don't end up with a view that's skewed somehow? I mean, certainly you can teach heaven, hell, this afterlife of punishment and rewards, ideas which weren't necessarily part of Native American conceptions, but some of those things you might be able to express through objects. But this essentially leads to a amalgamation or a hybridity among a lot of peoples in what we would call today Mexico and South America. And so, these things were ways that upset and overthrew society, which again, when you think about missionary work, what is, this raises a very important question. The Spanish Franciscans and the Jesuits that were with them later, and the Dominicans, they are justifying a lot of this endeavor by, these people are lost, they need to be saved no matter what. And so the focus is baptizing them for a lot of people. Even to the point of, yes, we don't think these people really understand what we're telling them, but they're being baptized, and so God's going to save them. Whether that comes through force, whether that comes through confusion, whether that comes through whatever. The notion is that this is going to bring about salvation. So how much, again, when you're engaging in missionary work, how much do you attempt to fully convince someone, right, before baptism? And so there's a lot of issues here with religious instruction. How much religious instruction is necessary? How, is it important for a person to completely have an understanding of the Trinity that's accurate? Now, certainly before baptism, no. Probably all of us, we would say no. Before you're baptized, before you're saved, no, you don't need that. But do you ever need to come to a complete grip of that? If you have a heretical view of the Trinity, because of the way in which a person has communicated it, what impact does that have? There's a lot of questions here. But then also the larger question of, especially when we think about going from a Western culture to non-Western cultures, how much of our attempt at bringing the message to another culture do we carry on with us Western ideas? Right. So, this will be the case in a couple centuries from what we're talking about now. But as particularly American missionaries, but British missionaries as well, go to Africa and go to African cultures where certain notions of modesty and nudity are not the same as Western views of nudity and modesty. How much of Christians, the converted Christians, need to adopt Western ideas of dress and modesty and nudity? How much of our ideas about those things are shaped by Western culture and not necessarily by Christianity? And this is kind of the idea that the Spanish are facing. They wanted to make them Spanish. And a lot of missionaries have undertaken that idea that in trying to convert people, they have wanted to make them American, they wanted to make them British, they wanted to make them Western, thinking that those things are important as well. So, this is an important idea for thinking about mission work, is, what of our notions of certain ideas are shaped by Western culture that may or may not be necessary to convince others to adopt? The larger question for the Franciscans at the time and the Spanish at the time was not so much this issue of missions, but really the larger question that is reflected in some of the things we've been talking about here is the question of, do the peoples that we are encountering in the Americas, what is their status before God? And really, when people began to think about this, there began to be a difference of opinion and view on just the nature of Native Americans. And I believe we talked a little bit about this in Survey of Church History, but I want to refresh it again. You know, there's essentially two views that developed, and some of the main people in this debate are Bartolomé de las Casas, Juan de Sepúlveda, Francisco Ruiz, and Jacobo de Testera. We'll basically just focus on Las Casas a little bit and talk a little bit about his life. He was the son of a conquistador merchant, born towards the end of the 15th century, 1474. His father had accompanied Columbus as a common soldier, but had gotten wealthy and was able to send his son to good schools. Bartolomé studied law and would eventually come to Cuba, 1502, when he is 28. And there he begins to see the birth of encomienda. Eventually he is ordained a priest in 1511. He's a Dominican, even though we've been focusing on the Franciscans. And he is made the chaplain of Cuba, so he has a pretty important responsibility. Well, as Las Casas continues to serve there in Cuba, he begins to become very concerned about the efforts and the actions of the conquistadors. He sees a chief, a Native American chief, captured in a rebellion, sentenced to be burned alive. Las Casas decides that he wants to try and save this guy from being burned alive, and believes that if he converts, that will spare him execution. And so Las Casas takes the opportunity to try to convince the chief to convert, and he says no. He refuses to convert and is killed, executed. And this makes a very, very deep impression on Las Casas. He will write a work called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies that will then be published in Spain and elsewhere. A very graphic account of the actions of the conquistadors and what they were doing in the area. But it was those kind of events that led Las Casas to attempt to try and change the situation for Native Americans. Again, the larger the issue that is going on here is this debate over the status of Native Americans. On the one hand, on the one side, you have Bartolomé de las Casas and Jacobo de Testera, and on the other hand, on the other side, you have Juan de Sepúlveda and Francisco Ruiz. Do Native Americans, for example, have the capacity for faith? Is it in their nature to be able to have faith? De Sepúlveda and Ruiz said no. Las Casas and de Testera said yes. These are people that are able to have faith. Ruiz was a Franciscan, believed that Native Americans were not capable of natural judgment, that they weren't able to receive faith. On the other hand, the other question, the larger question was, are Native Americans even human? With, of course, de las Casas, de Testera saying yes, de Sepúlveda, Ruiz saying no. Sepúlveda was a scholar of the classics, interested in Aristotelian philosophy. and used Aristotle's concept of the natural slave to say that Native Americans were deficient in their intellect, especially. They were born to be slaves. They could not master their passions. The emotions ruled over the intellect. They needed to be enslaved for their own good. It was the church's duty to enslave them. You know, and so Las Casas and Testera, Las Casas was a Dominican, Testeros a Franciscan, and they both appealed to other expressions of Native American culture. So De Testero said, well, look at the impressive buildings that are evident in the culture of these indigenous people. It's very subtle in the creation at times. This does not evidence a deficient intellect. It evidences instead a good intellect. The Native Americans express courtesy. They compose music. They're human. Yes, they're a different culture, but they're human. Now, some of those words De Testero would not have used, but essentially that's the idea. And Las Casas, of course, suggested that the Native Americans were pure. They were closer to God's ideal. But essentially, both sides are viewing Native Americans as we Europeans know better. And so, in both respects, they're seeing the Native Americans as children. These are children that need to be shaped by European ideals for their own good. Now, again, I say that, and I don't want to say, you know, yeah, absolutely, they need the gospel just like everybody else. But some of the other expressions of culture, Spanish culture, I think in many respects there was probably some things that didn't need to be adopted by Native Americans that others were pushing for. And so on the one side, you have people saying, you know, Native Americans should be enslaved. On the other hand, people saying they shouldn't, but there's still this notion, this paternalistic notion of, you know, they need guidance. Eventually, the Pope would get into this discussion. Paul III, Pope at the time, would release Sublimis Deus in 1537, coming down on the side of Native Americans are human, they have the capacity for faith, they are not to be enslaved. So a clear statement, but you know, not one that necessarily worked its way out. It had some effect on encomiendas a few years after this, and encomiendas legally ended, but it did not bring it to an end. It did encourage priests to censure conquistadors who were acting inappropriately, or not living according to Christian ideals. But it didn't fully end all of this. And so it did give the way for certain types of missions that were emphasizing more persuasion than force, but it didn't fully end that either. Another important expression of the intertwining of missionary efforts and imperialism was the requirement, or the requiremento. Essentially, this was a way for the Spanish to try and claim authority over Native American spaces. The purpose of the statement was to indicate that God had established the Pope's authority through Peter, and, you know, through the Pope, the Spanish had been given by the Pope the natives' land. Right? So God, and then through Christ, Christ to Peter, Peter to the Pope, Pope to the Spanish king. The Spanish king said, and or the Pope said to the Spanish king, you can have this particular land. In the requirement, the reading of the requirement, natives were told to submit to the Spanish forces to allow for missionaries, or if they did not, they would face attack. If the natives did not submit, they would be subject to violence, and the goal of this, according to the requirement, was, if you're not going to voluntarily submit to Catholicism and its rightful representatives, the Spanish, you'll be forced to. In a sense, there's a ritualistic component here in the notion that this must be read before any efforts would take place, but it wasn't always read in a way that was legitimate. Sometimes it would be read at full speed, of course being read in Spanish, not necessarily a language a lot of natives understood in beginning years here, of course. It may or may not have been read in the presence of an audience. There seems to be some cases where the person responsible for reading it would go out at night, everybody's asleep, read the requirements, next morning, nobody's submitting, let's go in. The Spanish throne said we had to read it, but we're not necessarily reading it in a way that wouldn't give the natives time to make a decision or know that they have to make a decision. There does appear to have been some hybridity here from Islam. There's probably some influence here. There are certain schools of Islamic thought that required the announcement of Islam to a people that were, that supposedly God had decided were going to be punished through warfare, and so they were given the chance to submit. There was this invitation to accept Islam to avoid the warfare. So maybe there's an influence there. Las Casas claimed that the requirement was Islamic in nature, but there's also some Christian influence there as well. There's similar thoughts in Deuteronomy chapter 20. So there might be an influence here from Islam. There might not. It's kind of like one of those things of history that we don't have a lot of information about, but if there is the influence there from Islam, of course, for the Spanish, that would be a really interesting idea of how they've taken the Spanish. I mean, we're right after the Reconquista, and so to have adopted some of these things is unusual. So it's probably a hybrid of Islamic and Christian ideas. That brings us to a conclusion here of thinking about the Spanish. I want to turn and talk a little bit about the French. The French begin their their desires for expansion somewhat after the Spanish, and so now we're getting into a time period where it's Protestantism has developed, etc. So we're getting our history kind of again out of whack, simply because we're doing more of a topical examination here. So by the time that the French are really active, Protestantism has taken place, so much so that the Jesuits have developed. The Jesuit order is an order that develops in that 16th century as Protestantism is developing. It's not entirely a response to Protestantism, but we could say kind of comes around the same time, maybe a little bit before, but it becomes very approaches the issue much like they approach Protestantism as a problem just like they approach other issues. And Protestantism is a problem for the Jesuits just like other issues are. But the French are coming later. They're coming in the 17th century as opposed to the late 15th and into the 16th. There is not as large an army that comes with the French as does with the Spanish. The French, while they are in some places like Louisiana, right, there's a lot of French influence there. Most of the focus of the French is in North America, in what we would call today Canada. They are approaching it differently as well. They learned the language. They gained the trust of the Native Americans. They recognize the Native Americans as human. There's not that same kind of debate. So there's some differences here as well. The French aren't as closely tied to the Pope as the Spanish are. Some of that has to do with the Avignon papacy, the Babylonian captivity of the church, the Great Western Schism, all those things that we talked about in Survey of Church History. Let's briefly talk about the background of the Jesuits. We really didn't talk about the Jesuits much in Survey of Church History, simply because we kind of ran out of time. But just to refresh your memory, the Jesuits were started by a man named Ignatius Loyola. Loyola was born to an aristocratic family in Spain and had served in the Spanish army. And due to that, of course, he ends up getting injured during a battle, and he spends some time reading while he's recovering and believes that he has a higher calling, something more than just being a soldier. Around this time as well, he will claim to have a vision of Mary, and Mary kind of calling him to a higher life, to be a spiritual soldier rather than just a physical soldier. He will decide to go off, live in a cave as a hermit, where he'll have more of these visions, and he'll decide to dedicate his life to serving Christ and the Catholic Church. Out of that, he will write a work called the Spiritual Exercises. Essentially, Spiritual Exercises was a manual for self-improvement. It was exercises on how to pray. It was exercises related to, this kind of personal self-improvement. It will develop over time and will eventually develop into the manual that will run the Jesuit order. The order that he'll start out of this, kind of gaining people that will follow this path, becomes known as the Society of Jesus, often referred to as the Jesuits. Here too, another little tidbit: if you ever see a Catholic author with the letters S.J. after their name, that indicates that they are Jesuit. They're a member of the Society of Jesus. Early recruits to the society had the vow to serve the Pope. This was another one of those orders that was directly tied to the Pope and not to the bishop of the local region. They also were focused on living a life of poverty and chastity. And the early order especially was focused on conversion of Muslims. And so, it's about converting the Turks, right? Going to the east and converting the Turks. The Jesuits grew rapidly between 1540 and 1555. A lot of the focus is on education as well as mission work to various places. They were engaged in various acts of charity. There was, in many respects, a militaristic attitude or mindset. That Loyola's experience as a soldier led to the Society of Jesus being very much like a military organization. There was an emphasis on obedience to those that were above you. There's a hierarchy that's established. And Ignatius was very strong. Ignatius Loyola was a very strong leader in all of this, a ruler in a sense. And as Protestantism develops, the Jesuits also became concerned about Protestantism and not just education and mission work. Now, when the Jesuits become involved in missionary efforts to North America, they would write a variety of reports back to people in Europe, particularly in France, describing various things that had taken place, conversions, schools being built, interactions with important tribal leaders, all sorts of things. No, these things are known as the Jesuit relations, is what they're called today. And these stories of missionary work are still around today. You can Google them and find copies of the Jesuit relations, a variety of the reports of interactions between Jesuits and the Native Americans, the northern Native Americans, particularly the Iroquois, the Huron, some of those tribes. And in many respects, one of the difficulties the Jesuits faced was when they came to North America, they found themselves in a situation where there's a lot of intertribal warfare going on, particularly the Iroquois and the Huron. And so, they're kind of caught up in the midst of this, and so, there's all sorts of stories of capture and torture and even cannibalism and all sorts of things that the relations report. The Jesuits were martyred in large numbers because of some of this back and forth. They were referred to as black robes because they wore a black robe, and they were taken prisoner and tortured and killed, like other Native American prisoners would have been. If the Iroquois took a Huron leader captive, it was the same type of punishment that could be faced. So really interesting stories of this time. But let's focus mostly on talking about the missionary endeavors. So a couple of things were very important in thinking about what were the Jesuits trying to do. Well, like the Franciscans, baptism was very, very important, and there was a lot of focus on baptism. And baptism became a very important ritual for the Jesuits in converting Native Americans. And often Native Americans, it's like with a lot of missionary encounters, it's often difficult to say, are the people that we read about or hear about, are they converting because they have been convinced of the truthfulness of Christianity and are certain that that they want to give their lives to Christ? And of course, if we look back in history, it makes it even more difficult, because that kind of answer is dependent upon an interior experience or interior position that we don't have access to. We only can, if we have historical records, is about what was done. So when the Iroquois, for example, come to the Jesuits to be baptized, why are they being baptized? Are they being baptized because of their conviction of sinfulness and their desire to adopt Jesus as their Lord, etc.? Probably for some of them that was the case. Are they coming because they feel like the French God has conquered their culture and they're trying to adopt some of the power that the French have over them, or maybe even more so with the Spanish? Probably for some that was the case. Do some come to baptism because they are desiring healing, or they're desiring some sort of benefit out of it? Yeah, that probably was the case too for a lot of people. And there's not necessarily this interior experience or this interior disposition of I'm looking for salvation. It's I'm looking for healing, I'm looking for success, I'm looking for some sort of benefit to come out of it. So there are probably a lot of people who are coming to this for these other reasons. Another important aspect and that's how, but that's how the Jesuits are counting their success. They're counting it based on the number of people that are requesting baptism, and they're counting conversions based on baptism. But they, whether or not they know, are these people repenting? Are they understanding Jesus is their Lord? What does that mean? Another important aspect for the Jesuits was their generosity. That through their generosity, they were hoping to make relationships with the Native Americans in connecting with these people. Well, what were the results? Well, like I said, right, they're counting conversions based on baptisms, understandably so. But what these people were actually thinking, in some cases, there would be places where native peoples would be baptized in large numbers, perhaps even a whole village. But within a couple decades, that had been completely, there's no Christian Catholic presence, right? And so it's not, the baptism doesn't necessarily lead to a complete change in Christian life. Now, there is some success in some places. The Iroquois today, you have some Catholics, you have some Protestants, a lot of Seventh-day Adventists among the Iroquois as well. So, some of that comes from the French, some of that comes from later missionaries. Certainly, the Protestantism comes from, it's more English missionaries later on. So it's a mixed bag of results, and certainly from the Jesuit standpoint, the number of people lost, the number of Jesuits lost is significant as well. Spain and France weren't the only kingdoms looking for expansion. Portugal was another one expanding its control. Portugal would also have some place in the Americas. We'll talk about that briefly in a little bit. But we'll talk about some other areas that the Portuguese were going as well. One was to Africa. In Africa, as we've talked about before, Africa had been Christianized in the early centuries of Christianity, but then a lot of that had been undone by the spread of Islam. But there's an interest among the Portuguese and other Europeans about trying to find a route to the Far East that doesn't have to go through Muslim-controlled lands. And so a lot of that, of course, the Middle East, of course, a lot of Muslim dominance. And so the hope was through Africa, you could, kind of push forward through Africa, Christianize Africa, or at least northern Africa, and take those lands from the Muslims and create a Portuguese empire that would provide a route to the Far East. So, again, Crusader mentality here. This is understood as a Crusader effort. But eventually, those efforts in Africa lead to the slave trade. And so while this is originally the focus is the Far East and Islam, it does set the stage for the African slave trade as well. There's kind of some missionary endeavors tied up with the slave trade, which we'll talk about in another part from more of an English standpoint. Efforts by the Portuguese into India and China and Japan are very similar, like some things we talked about with the Spanish. Missionaries are going along with the explorers. Two very important individuals involved in this process are Francis Xavier and Matteo Ricci. both of them Jesuits. Xavier's focus was on teaching children, and then through the children getting to the adults. And so converting the children and then connecting with the adults. Now, some of Xavier's success had to do with the power of the Portuguese Empire at this time. And so that military presence, just like for the Spanish, probably did have some influence on his conversions. As Xavier went into India, he saw some success with the lower castes of Indian society. A lot of people in those lower rungs of society saw it as a way up, or at least a way out, maybe. But that led to people in the higher classes being concerned about Christianity or refusing to accept Christianity because, those societal things about the structure of society and your class in society were so ingrained in Indian society that it works against any sort of high-class conversion. Now, Xavier sometimes found himself in conflict with the Portuguese army because they had their goals, and Xavier had his goals. And for the military, there were concerns that an increase in conversions would lead to difficulties with trade. And so there was some conflict there. Xavier would attempt to go to China, and he's not really able to do much in China. He would go to Japan. He would be successful there as well. But after Xavier died, persecution of Christians in Japan essentially led to the church or Christianity disappearing in Japan. So, much like the Spanish, the efforts of the Portuguese expressed in Xavier were these kind of give them European names, make them dress like Europeans, adopt other European habits as well. So it's kind of not only is it a conversion to Christianity, it's a conversion to Portuguese culture. Matteo Ricci, on the other hand, was able to enter China. So he does have some success in missions in China, and we've talked about some of the struggles Christian missionaries have faced in China. We'll continue to see that as we get into the 19th century as well. He takes a slightly different approach. He decides to learn Chinese language, Chinese culture, and kind of slowly move into Chinese society with the idea of earn the respect of the people, learn their language, learn their culture. Well, there's some acceptance there. He does have some opportunity, but he's still very restricted. The time period we're talking about, there's a lot of suspicion of outsiders from the Chinese. And so, especially missionaries, and so there's this great concern. So Ricci has a difficulty. So one of the things he attempts to try to do is connect Western theology, Western philosophy with Chinese philosophy in some areas. So he writes a work on friendship. And so he kind of writes it from a standpoint of some traditional literary approaches of the Chinese with some Western philosophy, which, provides him access to upper classes. The scholars are interested to hear more about what what Ricci has to say. He's invited to the imperial court to discuss astronomy because of some of the things that he does about astronomy. But he's not trying to build church buildings. He's keeping his audiences small. He doesn't want to have these huge settings, which would be immediately kind of suspicious. But he's also concerned about ancestor worship, Confucianism. Is this idolatrous? Is this not idolatrous? Is this something that I should try to work against? Right. So there's there's a lot of questions that missionaries to China have had to address, and Ritchie is an example of this as well. The Portuguese, of course, are also active in Brazil. Of course, that's where they're importing African slaves to help with the trade. There is some work by missionaries to condemn the colonists for their mistreatment and their cruelty, particularly when it comes to indigenous peoples. On the other hand, some missionaries are more than willing to use the fear of the Portuguese Empire to preach. And just like with Spain, there were hybrid movements that developed in Portuguese-controlled lands, that just like the Spanish, where you kind of have this hybrid of indigenous ideas and Catholic ideas kind of melding together, especially when it came around like holy people. And so, those holy people are actually representations of the saints, right? So this saint is this holy person, combining the two. And so, these efforts, of course, reflect this intertwining of missionary work with imperialism, and with that, of course, it raises a lot of challenges and questions, some important issues that even today we have to think about. Certainly we don't see the same kind of efforts, let's say, from the United States in trying to conquer peoples through military force. But there is an imperializing aspect of Western culture and American culture that is affecting a variety of places. And so how much do we encourage that, prevent that, work against that in trying to reach out to peoples that aren't part of Western cultures? So there's a lot of ways in which we need to be concerned about mission work from the standpoint of this intertwining it with a nationalism that may or may not necessarily communicate those things that the gospel truly communicates. And so we see how these people of the past answered those questions, probably in some ways that we wouldn't necessarily support. But it's also something that even today Christians need to investigate. The next videos of this session will focus on kind of a different track, as I mentioned at the beginning of this one, where the focus is more on this kind of moving to Protestantism in some ways, but the development of people and thought that is going to be labeled heretical, but it is missionary, as these people are trying to share their ideas, particularly about reform or change that they think is needed to be made. There will also be a section on the Black Death, the Black Plague, and the impact that makes on Europe, because that's also very important here in thinking about the religious consequences of what the bubonic plague did to European society and how that affects a lot of these issues as well. And then we'll have just kind of a short section after that. I'll focus on some specific issues related to the preaching efforts of John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, or Jan Hus, as Professor Rees is going to refer to him. That's more of the European pronunciation. I'm anglicizing it more. And so we'll talk more about that just briefly, because he'll highlight some things. And so I'll briefly touch on that to try and tie it all together. So that's kind of where we're going from this point on.